ASMR Who, and in this video we're going to be continuing our journey through the Big Finish main range, the monthly adventures. We're going to be talking about releases 16 through to 19, which of course are the first releases, make up the sort of first season of stories featuring Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor, and of course they introduce India Fisher as Charlie Pollard as well. These have been the ones I've been sort of most looking forward to since starting going through the monthly adventures, the main range. Sort of these ones and the Colin Baker ones, because those are the two. Colin Baker, people talk a lot about how his Doctor was mellowed and sort of arguably saved by Big Finish, and of course Paul McGann for a very long time only had the TV movie in terms of on-screen live action material, and a lot of his stuff was just on audio. And even now, we've had stuff like Night of the Doctor and the Power of the Doctor, but still not lots of material. Paul McGann's Doctor is primarily an expanded universe Doctor in novels and of course in audio and comics and stuff, but the novels and audio are the two main ones. And I've been very intrigued to get to meet the 8th Doctor properly, basically. Of course I've seen the TV movie before, I've seen it a couple of times, but I was very excited to hear what the 8th Doctor would be like in Big Finish. And so these 4 stories begin a continuous, ongoing run for the 8th Doctor. It's just these 4 for now, and then the next 6, I think, go back to the 5th, 6th and 7th Doctor stuff, and then you get some more Paul McGann, and so on. But I enjoyed all of these, generally speaking. I'll just talk generally before we go into sort of specifics about like Paul McGann. I think of course is fantastic. I think you can tell he's still warming up to it and getting in the groove of audio. Occasionally there's a couple of lines that don't quite land, but generally I think he's pretty good. He feels certainly comfortable in the role, which, given that this was like 4 or 5 years after doing the film, he kind of slips back into it pretty easily, and he definitely feels comfortable in the role. And I think a big part of that is India Fisher as Charlie Pollard, of course introduced in this run, who has gone on to become a very, very popular Big Finish original character. She's a lot of fun. She's got a great dynamic with McGann. She's kind of a bit like Ace in that, not that the character's like Ace, but in the sort of sense of she doesn't necessarily feel like the traditional classic series companion. But of course this is 2001, so we've not had the new series yet. And I know like Lucy Miller is an 8th Doctor companion who very much takes inspiration from Rose Tyler, but Charlie feels kind of like Ace in that there's a sort of, she feels in that transitional period between the more traditional idea of a companion and what the companion role would become in the new series, which Ace very much feels like. You know, she's a little bit more grounded, and there's a character arc there and a story arc about the companion, which is true of Charley. They have a great dynamic. They're great in all four of these stories. So we'll start, of course, with Storm Warning. It's written by Alan Barnes. This was fun. It was a decent story. This is about the R101, which is an airship. There's a real thing, I believe, from 1930. The R101 was a voyage, an airship that went on its maiden voyage, and crashed over France. Ended up in a storm over France and crashed. This is a real event. None of the characters in this story are real people, though. The story was interesting. It kind of developed into something I didn't expect at all. With some, interesting sort of alien characters. But it was decent and a good introduction to Charley. Of course, this sets in motion the story arc, which, if you're unaware, Charley Pollard is a adventuress, sort of, who goes on the R101 basically as a stowaway, I think. Like, sneaks aboard, but is destined to die in the crash. But then she doesn't. She escapes with the Doctor. He saves her. But from my understanding, that impacts time and the web of time and stuff like that, and so there are consequences later down the line. You don't really get that so much in these four stories. But this does introduce creatures called vortices, which are sort of like dinosaur, pterodactyl creatures that live in the vortex. One of them ends up in the TARDIS at the end of this story, called Ramsey. They call him Ramsey. But this vortices can sort of sense something going on with Charley at the end of the story. And it sort of sets up this story arc. Very interesting that you don't actually ever hear Charley's reaction to the TARDIS. At the end of Storm Warning, they are heading to the TARDIS, basically, and then, come the next story, they're already in there, so you don't get to hear a reaction, which is a little bit interesting. But Storm Warning was decent. Did I say it was written by Alan Barnes? It's written by Alan Barnes anyway, if I didn't already say that. This had a weird performance in it, though. The side characters were decent, but there was a weird performance, I felt, from Barnaby Edwards, who plays a character called Rathbone in this. Barnaby Edwards, as far as I'm aware, has a role in all four of these stories. And you can notice him. This one is probably the most sort of major role. I found it quite distracting, though, because he has this South African accent. I just found it very off-putting because it doesn't sound genuine. And he kind of ends up in a sort of villainous role, an antagonistic role. but I just found the character really the accent I found very off-putting and a little bit cringeworthy, to be honest. I thought it was bad. The character itself was decent, but I just was not sold by the accent. And I wasn't sold by Barnaby Edwards. I was a bit unsure. I don't know why he was in all four of these stories. I don't know why he needed to be in all of them. I think in some of them he has smaller roles, but I found his continuous presence, because he's a different character in all four, but I found that to be a little bit odd. The next story, though, we'll move on, is Sword of Orion, a Cyberman story, which is written by Nicholas Briggs. It's the first. It's the first Cyberman story in Big Finish, and I had a lot of fun with this. I think of the four, it was probably my favourite. It's a fairly standard story, basically a base under siege, but there were some really interesting elements in this, some interesting characters. There's a character who's at one point captures the Doctor and Charley, accuses them of murdering someone, and then any time they try and talk, he immediately tells them to shut up. He's quite irritating, but I think that's deliberate, and he sort of mellows out as the story goes on. And there's a side character in this called Diva Johnson, voiced by Michelle Livingstone, who is a really fun. She ends up in a lot of scenes with the Doctor. She kind of becomes a surrogate companion a little bit, and yeah, she's a lot of fun in this. There's some interesting sort of twists and turns, and the Cybermen have it's a good outing for the Cybermen. I think this is quite a popular story. On the Big Finish app, in the sort of plot synopsis for the story, which they always have, it's got a synopsis, and then it also says there's a little blurb that says one of our very best-selling releases. So they're clearly very proud of this story and how popular it is. And I understand why it's popular, because I thought this was good. I thought it was fun. It's not the most groundbreaking story, but it's nice to see the 8th Doctor against a familiar enemy. And it's always nice to get a strong Cyberman story. I listened to another Cyberman story recently, which was also very strong, which I'll talk about in another video coming shortly, which, if you're keeping track of what I'm listening to at the moment on this channel, you can probably guess what I'm referring to. But it's always nice when you get a Cyberman story that's strong for the Cybermen, because sometimes they can be a bit hit and miss. Their stories can be a bit hit and miss. They're great villains, but they don't always get great stories. And even sometimes they do get a really good story but it doesn't necessarily take full advantage of the Cybermen as villains. Like Earthshock, for example, is a great story, but the fact that they're Cybermen is they're kind of interchangeable. It's not really integral to that story. It's a great story, but the Cybermen are not. It would work with a different foe. Whereas, there's really interested their involvement in this story. That's not the case. And they're just decent. It's a good story. I found it interesting that even though the design, the cover design indicates that these Cybermen from the invasion, the voices are very clearly inspired by the 80s Cybermen, which I think works. bit clearer voices to understand. But I do very much like the invasion design, so I think it's the best of both worlds, to be honest. But yeah, Sword of Orion was a strong story. I really enjoyed it. Next we move on to the Stones of Venice, which is written by Paul Mars. An interesting story. I think probably my least favourite of the four. Not bad, but I just found it the least interesting. In the majority of these stories, I would say with the exception of Storm Warning, but even then, in like part 3 and 4 of that story, it's interesting because you have the Doctor and Charley separated for quite a majority of all of these stories. And I think I found that to be interesting, more so in the next story, but this story and the next story, where that's most true. And I found it odd that they already seem to have this very well-formed dynamic, but we've only had a couple of adventures with them. The Stones of Venice is about the Doctor and Charley go to Venice in the 23rd century, I believe, and it's sinking. But it's sinking because of a curse, and there's a guy who runs Venice who has lived for 100 years, and there's cults and stuff. It's an odd story. And I just felt that I didn't hate it, but I kind of this one didn't quite land for me. I enjoyed it well enough, but it's definitely my least favourite of the 4 stories. I just didn't feel like they really properly made use of the Venice setting, and I think the idea of going to Venice at a time when it's sinking is a really interesting idea, and it just doesn't really, for me, it doesn't really take advantage of that idea in the way I'd like it to. You may be able to hear a bit of background noise. I do apologise about that if you can. Yeah, I don't have much to say about the Stones of Venice, to be honest. It was decent. It's the one I would find the hardest to recommend, to be honest, because, Storm Warning is, of course, the first McGann audio introduces Charlie. Sword of Orion is a strong Cyberman story. We'll get to the next story in just a minute. That is odd, but the Stones of Venice has an interesting premise, but then for me didn't really deliver on the possibilities of that premise. And it's set in the future, but it really feels like a historical. It just didn't quite come together for me personally. So, whilst I didn't hate Stones of Venice, I didn't love it either. It was still good. It was still good. You don't really. The thing with audio is you don't really get bad ones. The quality is a lot more consistent, I find, so far anyway, for me. But of these 4, I think Stones of Venice was, I would say, the weakest. It's my least favourite anyway, but yeah. And then the final one of these 4 is Minuet in Hell. This is written by Gary Russell and Alan W. Lear. It's notable because it's got the Brigadier in it. Again, it's another Brigadier story after Spectre of Lanyon Moor. It's the first story with the 8th Doctor and the Brigadier. This story is set in America, early 21st century. I think it's 2003, but that might be confirmed by someone else. And there's this new state, the 51st state. It's called Malabolgia, which is a silly name. But there's this sort of institute that is sort of supposedly helping people with I'm not sure how you put it, essentially asylum patients, and they have these asylum patients, one of which is the Doctor, voiced by Paul McGann, who, this is probably the first instance of the 8th Doctor having amnesia, certainly in audio, which is something he has quite a lot, I believe. This is an interesting story for Paul McGann because he's really out of it for the majority of the story. He's in this sort of asylum cell, but the guy next to him is a character called Gideon Crane, who is voiced by Nicholas Briggs in like a proper performance, like not just the Daleks or the Cybermen, not that those aren't proper performances, but it's Nick Briggs playing an actual character, individual character, you know what I mean, who is talking to the Doctor for a lot of the story. And it's very interesting. The cliffhanger to part 2 is he starts talking about all these companions, starts naming all the companions that the Doctor hasn't mentioned yet. And this character, Gideon Crane, goes, "You're not the Doctor, I am." And then you wonder what's going on there, and it's all explained, of course. This is set in America. It's got some not brilliant American accents, but this is also really weird and campy. It involves like demons and satanic worship. It's called Minuet in Hell, obviously. It's a weird, campy story, but I kind of liked that aspect of it. There's a devil demon character in this who possesses one of the human characters and talks through him, but he's kind of goofy and silly. He's still menacing, and he tortures people and wants to talks about eating them, but he's kind of catty and campy. I understand that this is a little bit of a controversial story for those sorts of reasons, but personally I enjoyed it. I had fun with it. It's always nice to hear Nicholas Courtney as the Brigadier. But again, this was a story where I really noticed the Doctor and Charley being separated again. And they also basically repeat a plot element from the Stones of Venice in this, which I found very odd, that 2 stories in a row have a similar, it's not a massive thing, but a similar beat, which was odd. But this was good fun. It's not the best Big Finish story, but I had a lot of fun with it. I thought it was campy and silly and just fun, just a lot of fun. So, yeah, that's I enjoyed it. But those are my thoughts on these 4 stories. As you can tell, I'm a little bit disappointed, not disappointed, a little bit underwhelmed, I suppose, because I don't have all that much to say about these 4 stories. None of them were bad, but none of them were standout stories. I felt the strongest for me, as I say, was Sword of Orion, and then I would probably say Minuet in Hell, just because it kind of is willing to be a bit silly and dares to be a bit out there and different. And then Storm Warning, and then Stones of Venice, I would say. But yeah, these were fun, but I did feel that there were elements that I found a little repetitive. The Doctor and Charley constantly being separated. There's a lot of recurring cast members. Of course, as I mentioned, Barnaby Edwards, it plays a different character in all four of these. Helen Goldwyn is in at least three out of four. Yeah, 3 out of 4 of these. It's still early days for Big Finish at this point, of course, but I do feel like the small cast of these is it only limits them, I think, especially when you've got like Barnaby Edwards doing accents with weird accents that he's not quite nailing. And I don't mean to be disrespectful or anything to the guy. I'm sure he's a lovely guy and a great actor. But I don't know why they made him do a South African accent. The accent he does in Stones of Venice is sort of course, Italian. Doesn't quite work either. It's not quite as abrasive, but it doesn't quite work for me anyway. So these stories were decent, but I do have my problems with them. I do have my nitpicks. I enjoyed them. I look forward to hearing more from the 8th Doctor and Charley as we continue with the range. As I say, this storyline with Charley that's set up in Storm Warning kind of doesn't come up again until Minuet in Hell, when she's basically told, you're already dead. That's as much as you get with that plot strand in these 4 stories. So I do look forward to hearing more from the 8th Doctor, but as it stands, I like these stories. None of them are my favourite of the main range so far, though. But they're also, none of them are my least favourite, so they're kind of middle of the road, which makes them a little bit hard to talk about, particularly. But I did enjoy them, so those are my thoughts. I'm trying to still keep these at a sort of pace of one story a week, as it would be, and I want to sort of try and get one of these Big Finish review videos out more or less every month, a main range review videos out more or less every month. This should be out on Friday, which I think is March the 1st, so I've just sort of missed February, but it's still keeping with the original release schedule of every a Big Finish review every Friday. But yeah, those are my thoughts on those 4 stories. Have you listened to them? What did you think of them? Are there any recommendations for the 8th Doctor, and possibly Charley as well? Any to look forward to? Chimes of Midnight, of course, is a story I'm very much looking forward to. That's a big fan favourite. And yeah, please do like and subscribe and those things if you haven't done already. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I will see you next time for the next. I think I'm going to do another batch of 4. I think the next lot is another batch of 4, because I've been sort of working out the sort of I'm going to split them, so it'll be another batch of 4 next time, starting with Lou Garou, I believe that's how you pronounce it, which gets a preemptive reference in Minuet in Hell, I believe. But until then, as I say, thank you very much, and I will see you in another